Welcome to Conversations with Matt DeLockery. Today we're going to look at the next step in the development of Christian theology, and those are the letters we find in the New Testament. I say next step, but really, at this point in history, several things were happening at once. First, churches were being planted, not only in Palestine, but across the Roman Empire. Second, letters were being written to these churches, or more specifically, to the people in them and the people leading them. And third, the Gospels were being composed. We're going to talk about the Gospels in the next episode, so we're going to hit pause on that for right now. I do want you to know, however, that these things were happening at the same time. The first two, however, the planting of churches and the writing of letters, are related, and this episode is going to focus on the two of them. So, letters. You may have heard the term epistles before. Well, epistles are letters. Epistles is a Greek word, letters is the English word. Since the New Testament is written in Greek, we often hear the word epistles. 21 of the 27 books of the New Testament are letters. There are no letters in the Old Testament. But make no mistake, these are letters. It is not the book of Romans, it is the letter to the Romans. It is not the book of Galatians, it is the letter to the Galatians. Understand? So what was the point of a letter? Basically, a letter was a substitute for a face-to-face encounter. In the ancient world, there was no digital communication. No email, videos, cell phones, internet, etc. If you couldn't meet face-to-face, writing a letter was really your only option. I suppose you could use smoke signals, but those had a limited range and took a really long time. Besides the lack of digital communication, though, travel was a problem. Travel could take a while, depending on the distance. Because of that, face-to-face meetings were much harder to arrange than they were today. Imagine trying to make meetings happen with someone who is in one or more states away, or for that matter, even a city or two away. If the fastest form of transport was a horse, or a ship, the kind with sails, it took a while to get somewhere. And if you spent all your time traveling, you really could never get anything done. So letters were used to keep up communication between individuals and groups. And reading these letters lets us take a look into their conversations. The letters we find in the New Testament were not meant to be standalone works. Remember, we're looking into their conversations. They were originally meant as a part of growing Christianity and building up of the individuals in the real world. Paul, for example, planted churches on his missionary journeys. Then he wrote to them while he was planting other churches or when he was in prison. This was how he continued to pastor the churches he started while he was elsewhere. And this actually brings us to another point. The letters we have were primarily written to deal with specific issues specific churches or groups of churches were having. People like Paul were trying to build the early church. They wrote letters in order to help build the early church. These letters were not standalone theological works meant to be argued in a room full of scholars. There is quite a lot of theology in them, and rooms full of scholars debate their meaning now, but that was not their original intent. We do not see someone like Paul giving full statements of his theology. There are two letters, Romans and Colossians, where he does give a high-level view of his theology, and we can infer a lot of his main theological ideas, we think. But he does not write any standalone theological works. He addresses specific situations and he uses his theology to do it, and that's what's happening in both Romans and Colossians. These letters we're talking about were inherently practical and dealt with real issues that real people were having in real churches. They were aimed at trying to build up and grow early churches by building up and growing the people in them. What we do now when we argue about what the letters mean is try to figure out how what was said in the letters back then might apply to issues we have nowadays. So we look at how the New Testament authors dealt with situations back then, try to understand the general principles, and then translate that, as best as we can, into our time to try to figure out how to deal with the issues that we're having. There's a lot more discussion and debate now than there would have been back then, because we're several steps removed from the issues, though don't for a minute assume that there wouldn't have been discussion and debate back then. Now, all of this happened by a mixture of teaching, reasoning, persuasion, encouragement, and sometimes a little chewing out. And if you think about it, these are all closely related. Beliefs and actions are closely related, as we've talked about looking at Colossians, and we'll talk about again. So the teaching and reasoning parts of letters are all about helping people to believe the right things, which in turn leads to doing the right things. If you learn something new that changes the way you look at the world, it should change the way you act. If you act differently and practice living differently, it will change how you look at the world. The other parts of letters, the persuasion, encouragement, and chewing out, are all related to following through with the actions that follow from your beliefs. Assuming you know what you should be doing, then, if you're doing well, you need encouragement to keep doing the right thing. If you are sliding a bit, you might need some persuasion to return to the right path. If you've completely fallen off the wagon or decided that you really don't like wagons anymore, then you might need a wake-up call and the chewing out might take place. All of these things are closely connected because all of them are part of the relationship between people who are building the church and those who are part of the church and are trying to figure out how to live their lives as Christians. One way that letter writers taught people in churches is by taking central facts about Christianity and applying them to specific situations. Do you remember the oral traditions that we talked about in the last episode? In the letters in which they appear, they often function as the basis for further teaching. In other words, these traditions often formed the foundation, and then application of the current situation was made afterwards. Even when oral tradition was not used, or at least cited in a letter, they still followed the same basic process. Letter writers took what they knew about Jesus and said how Christians should act in a given situation because of that information. That means that there was information about Jesus that they were basing things on. Oral tradition was certainly a part of this. Word-of-mouth information was certainly part of this. Gospels in spoken forms would very likely have been part of this, but we'll talk more about that in the next episode. Something important to understand also is that the letter writers did not read things back into their knowledge base about Jesus. In other words, they were faithful to the traditions they had about Jesus. They didn't encounter a problem and say, well, Jesus never spoke on that, but we think he would have said X, so let's make him say X. We know this was not something they did because we have examples of them not doing this on some pretty big issues. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 7:10-12. Paul has been asked some questions about marriage by the Corinthians. Listen to part of his response. To the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest, I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. Now, in verse 10, Paul says, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. In verse 12, he says, to the rest, I say, I, not the Lord. He is distinguishing here between official teaching he has from the Jesus tradition and his own opinion. When it's his own opinion, he makes it clear that that's what it is. Two other big issues in the early church were whether or not Gentile converts needed to be circumcised and keep the Jewish law, and whether or not you could eat meat sacrificed to idols. These may not seem like that big to us now, but to them, these were no small matters. Now, it would have been really easy to say, Jesus said X, and just solve the matter. As far as we have record of, though, Jesus never spoke on these things. From what we can tell, early Christians left the oral traditions they had alone. They used them when they could, but they didn't read things back into them when they couldn't. Instead, they reasoned their way to an answer from other things, but what's important is that they didn't mess with the Jesus traditions. Okay, so now we've looked at what letter writers were trying to accomplish with their letters. How do they go about actually getting it done? Before we answer that question, we need to back up and look at who was writing the letters. The person who wrote the most letters, by far, was Paul. Paul's letters were primarily addressed to specific churches located across the Roman Empire, though some, 4, are addressed to individuals. I should mention that there is debate over which letters were actually written by Paul. 13 letters bear his name, but only 7 are generally accepted by scholars as being written by Paul himself. In the series I'm doing on Colossians, I spent some time talking about the authorship of the letter because it is not one of the 7 that are generally accepted, and yet I think Paul was involved. So if you want to go a little more in depth on one of the questionable letters, take a look at the episode titled Authorship of Colossians. Other letters bear the names of John, James, and Peter, as well as Jude and the author of Hebrews, who remained anonymous. When you look at the New Testament, the letters come after Acts and before Revelation. And they're arranged with Paul's letters first and everyone else's second. And within those divisions, Paul's longest letters come first and the shortest ones come last. And the same thing goes for the other letters, more or less. Hebrews is the longest of the non-Pauline letters. Jude is the shortest. That is, if you keep the 3 letters of John together and don't break them up. 1 John is longer than Jude, but 2nd and 3rd John are not. Anyway, so what happens when a letter got sent? Someone sent a letter, then the letter was received. In other words, mail happened. Now what? These letters were meant to be read aloud. Remember, we're talking about an oral culture. Most people could not have read them if they wanted to. The best estimates suggest that about 90% of people were illiterate, give or take. The letters would have to have been read aloud to a group of people, and then any instruction, discussion, or debate would have followed. Often the letter was carried by one or more individuals sent by the author, and these people would have been expected to explain what the author meant and answer any questions. We should understand, then, that letters do not represent a transition from oral to literary communication as primary. Most communications still happen orally and will continue to do so until much later in history. So let's ask another question. Would there have been just one letter? Probably not. In the ancient world, an author would often make more than one copy of a letter. If for no other reason, then keeping a letter gave the author a record of what he said. Think of this as your sent mail folder in your email. Keeping a collection of the letters one has written would be very useful to someone who writes a lot of letters. And the more time you put into a letter, the more you work on it, the more valuable a copy would be to you. The congregation receiving a letter would often make copies and distribute them. Some letters were specifically meant to be passed around. Others were not specifically meant to be passed around, but they would have been anyway. Suppose you were the pastor of a church, and the pastor of the church in the next city over got a letter from Paul or Peter or John. Wouldn't you want to read it? It was kind of an important thing. So even when a letter was not specifically designed to be passed around, copies would often be made and shared with nearby congregations. These copies will become important as we get into the manuscript question later on, and we'll try to figure out which version was most original. So, once a letter was received, would they have read the letter just one time? No. Letters would be read multiple times and people would teach lessons from them. The more a letter was valued, especially because of who wrote it, the more it would be taught from, and the more it would be copied. Loads of letters would have been written in the early church. The ones they thought most important would have been copied most and preserved the best. We know for a fact, though, that some letters have been lost. There are references in the New Testament epistles to other letters that we do not have copies of today. What we have today is what remains of the many letters that would have been sent and received in the early church. So where does all this leave us? If you remember at the beginning of this episode, we talked about several things happening at once. First, churches were being planted, not only in Palestine, but also across the Roman Empire. Second, letters are being written to these churches, the people in them, and people leading them. And third, the Gospels were being composed. A lot of things were happening during this period of rapid expansion of the church, and, I think, expansion of the church is the way it should be thought of. It is not so much that this was a letter-writing period. It was, but that was because the church was expanding so much and a lot of things had to be communicated to people you couldn't travel to easily, especially if you're writing from prison. Now, we've talked about the church expanding and letters being written to churches that have been planted, but we've not talked about yet is a third thing that was going on at the same time, the Gospels being composed. In the next episode, we're going to take a look at the Gospels and their role in the origins of the New Testament and round out this picture we have of the early beginnings of Christianity and how all of these things were playing together into shaping Christian thought.